Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are starting and kicking off our wellness webinar series for 2021, and our first wellness webinar will be on mentoring and wellness, how to support young people through today's mental health crisis. We know that this started as a global pandemic, a health crisis that has morphed into a few sort of realities that young people and the adults in their lives are facing through traumas and racial inequities, and some of the pieces that we know are happening in real time right before their eyes, and being able to be the adults in the room that are prepared to support them. And now we're going into this new phase of reopening our communities or going into hybrid structures that is going to impact the way that they interact after almost a year and a half of some young people being completely virtual and some having some hybrid, but not the complete normalcy that we would hope for everyone across the board. So today our experts are here to help us with this conversation, because this is what they do every day in their work, and why not have someone guide how we think and see the world when they're always interacting in that way in the places that they are and with our young people. So I'd like to introduce really quick Scott Bloom, who's the Director of School Mental Health for the New York City Department of Education. Welcome, Scott. Dr. Noreen Stewart, who's the founder and CEO of Stewart Learning, Inc., and has exceptional experience within school structures and systems here in New York as well. And Larry Scott, who's a school psychologist with the Buffalo Education System, and also a board member, and is really doing some great work with restorative justice that I think we'll be delving into today. And so I'm super excited to have you all three here with me having this conversation. And so just for the attendees to know, the chat is going to be active and live. The bios of these three wonderful individuals that are with us today will be there, so you can easily access and learn a little bit more about them if you haven't already. And then what we'll do is, in the next hour, you will have a conversation with me similar to the ones that we've had many occasions around these particular topics. And we will ask attendees to put their questions in the chat. And to the extent that we have time to get to their questions in our conversation, we'll do so. But if not, what we do is we'll do Mentoring Takes Two post this panel discussion, which will only focus on all of us answering your questions specifically that you had throughout this session. Okay, fair enough? All right, so I think we can stop sharing the screen now, and let's get our conversation started. So, you know, I think when we think about the last 18 months, it almost can take your breath away. The ebbs and flows that we've all experienced together, and how it's demanded different types of resilience from individuals, both adults and young people. So I wonder, despite the collective trauma and tragedy that we faced in these moments, how are young people showing up and demonstrating their resilience? And I know, Larry, that's a conversation we had very early on. Can you share with us some of your perspective in that?
Sure, thank you, Brenda. And just one clarification on my bio. I'm a parent and board member in Buffalo Public Schools, but I work as a school psychologist in a suburban district outside of Buffalo, Kenmore-Tonawanda School District. So this pandemic, certainly, there's no doubt it's had an impact on the mental health, social, emotional well-being of many people, including our youth. And the interruption in schooling has played a role. Social isolation played a role. I've seen it with students that I work with. I've seen it with my own children. And, you know, children certainly have needed that extra support, that intervention, our understanding and flexibility, and will continue to need all of that as we progress into the summer and next school year. However, my experience also leads me to believe that if we just focus on what we believe our kids are losing, and lose sight of their identities and where they are now, their innate abilities in the moment. I think we may be, presuming that they're doomed and their future is not bright. And I have experienced many students that have fared well, even with full remote instruction, including their social emotional wellness and learning. Some have even thrived in that type of mode of instruction. And when I have conversations with my students about the pandemic and schooling, I'm incredibly moved by their insight, their resourcefulness, their global perspective, deep understanding of empathy for others. And I don't buy the narrative that we hear frequently in the media that our youth are doomed from this pandemic experience. And I believe they're surviving, persevering. I believe they're being transformed to take on a world in front of them that is bigger and better ways that we can, as adults, maybe aren't best equipped for, and our youth are being prepared to take on those challenges that are ahead of them.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, our work is rooted in the fact that all young people have untapped potential that just needs to be, shined upon them sometimes. They know it's there. It's navigating getting there. And more importantly, that they're brilliant. So tell me, Noreen, as you're working with young people, what are some of the activities that you're doing virtually or in person to be able to start to pull some of what Larry is talking about, that brilliance and sort of that resilience that shows up? Because when I'm talking to youth practitioners, they're saying, well, they won't turn on their Zoom and they're not as chatty as they used to be. So how do we know that they're okay?
That is an excellent question. And so I would say I'm approaching it from both fronts. So virtually, I've been doing workshops, trainings, and discussions for mentoring and educational organizations on some of those key areas that are particularly salient during this climate. So one of those areas that's really important is that racial equity in education piece. So providing those practical strategies for identifying and improving equity in youth support programs. And everyone is doing great work here, and that's why you're here wanting to learn more. And one area that is oftentimes covertly insidious as a barrier is that achievement gap is growing for students of color, and that disparity is intensified during the pandemic, and it's seen a lot in their lack of kind of those skills around their learning. So one thing that we also focus on is working with the students in a way that can be truly authentic to yourself, in the sense that we all have things that we struggle with, and really relating with those students is what can make the difference. So I like to use 4 Rs when I'm working with students. So recognize, relate, reduce, and release. And the reason why relating is so important is because students are oftentimes feeling isolated and alone. And we can all remember back to when we were teenagers and you feel like you're the only one who's going through these experiences. Even though we as adults know that everyone is, it's so hard. So being vulnerable, being transparent, and having those informal moments with students. So it's not just kind of like the formal teaching times or formalized activities within your mentoring organization. It's those informal moments when they just want to hang out with you, they want to chill. I run something at our school called the Relaxation Zone. And so our school is very unique. It was founded by psychologists and it's run by psychologists. So it's a general ed school, but we have a very different way of looking at things. And so that club is as a time to bring students together, to hang out, to learn stress reduction techniques. That could be art related, music related. We play games. It's really just responding to where they are in the moment and being there for them in the ways that they need. So teaching them whichever strategies they need. So it could be diaphragmatic breathing one day, or it might be helping them focus on being mindful and present and not getting kind of sucked away in the vortex of all the difficulties that are going on. So really being there and meeting them for what they need in the moment.
Yeah, I think that's so important. You can have a great strategy and then your young people show up. and you have to be responsive. So Scott, as you're working with these systems and all these professionals that are doing this work, we got to get ready for this, right? And we're talking about sort of the systemic changes we have to disrupt in order to create more equitable spaces, more inclusive spaces, but more importantly, the big taboo spaces that are mentally, open and available to having conversations about mental health, right? I think that's still a taboo so much in our generations. What does that look like when you're trying to create systems that allow for those spaces to exist for young people?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for bringing up systems, because hearing Larry and Noreen talk about it sort of on the ground, my view is often the macro point of view, because working for the New York City Department of Ed is a very complex system, to say the least. But I want to kind of connect a few things. Larry was talking about sort of that resiliency that students have. It's not just bouncing back, but I also am thinking of it as insight resilience and knowledge resilience. And what Noreen is talking about is spot on, because we know when the students come back, or as they're coming back, as a system, we want to welcome them. We want to acknowledge what has been happening. We want to acknowledge the loss, the grief, but also who's here and who's not here. And we also want to acknowledge what's been happening in the culture. We want to be able to talk about the health disparities, the racial inequities, because as Noreen was saying, students want to talk about what's going on in their lives, and in some cases, what's been happening to them, what they've been witnessing, what they've been advocating for people of color, how they identify themselves is more important right now. So how do we do that? Well, one of the things that we're doing is we've created a Let's Talk campaign. So I think this gets to what you're saying, Brenda. This was student-led, student-voiced. They wanted to come back. They wanted to talk to adults. And he said the two things that are missing in schools is a trusted adult, someone they can just talk to, and confidentiality. So we worked we did a lot of informal groups with students, and we talked about, well, where's confidentiality? Where does it stop? And when is it because of safety measures? But also, what would it take to be a trusted adult? So we created this Let's Talk campaign, where we're getting all folks of the students of the school community trained in identifying, approaching, having conversations with students. So we're going to look at it as a mental health ally. And I think that goes to your point about destigmatizing mental health. Because you talk to a student and you say, hey, do you need any mental health services? Not me, no way. Hey, no. Do you know anyone who could? Oh, yeah, let me tell you, let me get all my, they bring in all their friends, right? So that stigma is still there, particularly with adolescents and middle school kids. So we're offering that campaign. We just started it a few weeks ago with the help of City Hall and the Jet Foundation, and we're going to be taking that into the summer and into the fall. The other thing we wanted, the DOE, we have implicit bias trainings, and in the Department of Health, we have the Race to Justice. So that's a lot about me, right? A white male looking at my own implicit biases, stereotypes, my projections, and how to be a better anti-racist than not, and what are those things? This year, we're taking that into the schools. Not that work ever stops, the self-work. So what are we doing? We created parent chats, because parents, I think, like my panelists, the friends are saying, they just want to talk about what's on their mind, what's going on out in the streets, what's going on at home. So we've created non-directive, informal groups. I heard that Larry does restorative justice, so we're using the circle structure to do that. The DOE is creating adult use, so that we actually have student voice to come into some of the units. This is the first time in the DOE. So I'm looking to you inform me, because at the end of the day, any system, and I'll stop here, any system in the schools, the ultimate person with those getting the services is the student and families and teachers and so on. So we always, sometimes we forget, because where I'm at with the bureaucracy and challenges and and complex systems talking to each other. I keep reminding folks we're here for the students. Let's remember that.
I love that. A lot of the foundational work of mentoring is around elevating youth voices, right? And how do you incorporate that into systems? And I think that people underestimate the power of allowing young people to feel the authority and the agency to say, this is what I really need. And then to be able to back it up with the resources and the wherewithal that we have. And I think until we combat some of those fears, we're not going to be able to get to a place where we're actually being real-time responsive to their needs. But Scott, I think you bring up this amazing point about restorative justice, and talk about a system that a lot of schools and a lot of young people are confronted with. We talk often about these racialized realities within a lot of the systems that young people are interacting with. School is no different when it becomes very punitive to have a behavioral infraction that ends up with an automatic suspension or expulsion. And how do we start looking at those policies and procedures to really start creating spaces of equity, right? And when we talk about the glass being full, there's resilience. And then when we talk about what it looks like in it being half empty after 18 months of maybe not even understanding what an anxiety attack, a panic attack, or your own mental health looks like, the reality is that behaviors might look a certain way come the fall that will become opportunity to be even more punitive with our young people. So Larry, talk to me a little bit about how your work has helped the school look differently with data and information, a system that actually fosters inequity.
Yeah, for the past 3 years now, my position in the Kenton district has been alternative to suspension specialist at a middle school and one of our high schools. So I implement conflict coaching, mediations, restorative conferencing, community service, and I do a sports club program for at-risk students. And essentially it is providing true alternatives to misbehavior in the school environment, trying to get a deeper understanding of what's impacting the behavior, trying to build personal responsibility, using the community to determine how to best resolve the misbehavior, the conflict, the incident that occurred, and then focusing on how we repair the harm that was caused from the misbehavior. I had to shift this year. I was more of a tier 2, tier 3 interventionist with my work previously. This year, with students starting full remote, I had to shift virtually. I had to get out of my comfort zone and get more comfortable with technology. And I started first hosting virtual support circles for staff because they were dealing with a lot of anxiety regarding the pandemic, the virus itself, constant changes, lots of uncertainty. And we always hear about if you need your staff to be well, for your students to be well. And so that's where I started focusing some of my work. And then from there, I began virtual support circles for our students in both the middle school and the high school. And it was just a tremendous experience. And I think Noreen really said this well, that students people in general need to be with others and have that conversation with others, that exchange of stories and experiences with others for that therapy. So circles, my mentor, Dr. Robert Spicer, indicated when I took his training that it's not therapy, but it's therapeutic. And so it is more of this informal conversation and just connecting on the experiences, the struggles, and maybe some of the advantages that came about as a result of the pandemic and having to change the way we instruct students and how we approach them. And I'll probably talk later on about how I think the pandemic and remote instruction and hybrid instruction compelled some of our school environments, our staff, to be more socially, emotionally responsive, more culturally responsive, more flexibility to just have those informal conversations with students that just are so important. Just checking in with them on a daily basis or checking out with them at the end of the day can really go a long way. It works for me. Whenever I have a check-in and somebody wants to, know how I'm feeling and how come I'm feeling a certain way, it grounds me and it works for me. So it certainly, I think, works with all of our staff and all of our students.
And I really love that because I think that a lot of times program practitioners who are outside of the school system lend a lot of those supports, but sometimes we get caught in building character and having a curriculum and outcomes, and we forget that it's the youth voice that should be driving it, and then it's the informal engagement that enriches it to get to this point where you're actually having, to your point, those therapeutic moments and creating spaces that might be a little more joyful than just transactional in nature for young people. So Noreen, you say that your school is founded and built by psychologists. So clearly everybody wants to know. So how do you make it, rooted in fun and still a learning environment, right? Because a lot of programs struggle with that. If you're an after school program, we're still trying to get work done and increase your reading score, but we want to have fun too because you've been in school for 8 hours, right? Or sometimes in these character development programs, we're so focused in trying to create those soft skills. So how do you infuse sort of the healthy psychological behaviors, components, systems, right, practices, in sort of those settings where you still have to make sure there's an outcome coming on the other side?
Absolutely. So my role in the school is kind of unique. It's a little atypical from a typical school psychologist role. So I still do, the testing and counseling individually, small groups, but we also teach. So I'm right there in the classroom, and I'm also there in the extracurricular activities. So one thing that I have learned is that it's super important to understand that we have students who are coming with a diverse set of learning needs. So my school has, it's a general education school, like I mentioned, but we have a support program, and then we have an additional higher level support program, which is where I primarily work. So those are students that typically have like IEPs or 504 plans eligible for those services. And so we're working with them on so many things at once, and it can be overwhelming. So instead of looking at a student and just saying, you have so many things you need to work on, because that's hard, there's a lot going on, but to say, you know what, using that acceptance as a starting point is so important, and you really can have fun with kids, because if you're like, there are things that I struggle with, we all struggle with something, and that's okay. Here are my strengths, here are the areas that I need to improve in. And so by doing that and getting more on their level with that, showing them that it's all a process is key. And I find that I'm able to infuse a lot of fun and authentic moments just being myself and being real with the students. So what I would say really is one of the main things to really undergird your approach is having a growth mindset. Because when you're able to cultivate a growth mindset, you're really able to overcome so many obstacles. Could be boredom, could be math, could be so many different things. So Dr. Carol Dweck wrote a book, Mindset, highly recommended. And it's looking at the differences between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. So when a student or an adult, anybody, has a fixed mindset, they assume that their abilities are relatively fixed. So you either have it or you don't, and they are going to be what they are. Someone with a growth mindset, though, however, believes that your intelligence and your abilities can improve through time and effort. And so when we're working with students and we're just looking at performance and we're not really looking at mastery, we notice a difference because they're trudging along. We're trudging along, so trying to meet certain benchmarks and keep it, moving and get the data. But if we're helping students to think, my intelligence is not predetermined or static, it can be developed, or it leads them to stop wanting to just look smart, but then really desiring to learn. And the students who have a fixed mindset are the ones who want to avoid challenges, and they're not embracing them like someone who has a growth mindset. So our job, I feel, is in order to enable students to be able to overcome these obstacles, is letting them know that they can be who they are and continue to grow. So where we are today is not necessarily where we're going to be tomorrow. And one of the elements within the program that I work with is I teach a class and create a curriculum that is literally just on, it's a cross between life skills, executive functions, decision making, self-advocacy, all the elements that kind of help them feel autonomous, and really helping them to do that. And so also supporting students in areas that are not just academic, that is so important. Because if a child is having a difficult time and you're there and your primary duties as after school programs, kind of getting that work done, let them also know that they're valued as a person, who they are, and that even though they may be struggling in this particular area, there's so many other areas that they can be doing well. And we have students who have, severe learning disabilities, really potentially debilitating ADHD, all sorts of different attentional issues, but we support them in the arts. We have amazing artists, amazing arts program. We do theater, and kids who came in feeling that they were just nothing, that they sucked, that they're dumb. These are words that students would use, or I can't do anything right, I can never learn. When you show them that they're more than just this one aspect, and you support them in other ones, I've seen kids come alive on stage who are incredible. So my suggestion is keep that growth mindset as the foundational underpinnings, but really also help them explore all of who they can be.
I love that. We actually do mindset training, growth mindset training for mentors. There's a great toolkit, mindsettoolkits.org, I think it is. My team will put it in the chat. It'll teach you how to have a growth mindset as a mentor and its impact, and also as a parent and as a teacher. But in this particular moment, as a mentor, having a growth mindset is really important. But that leads me to my question, Scott. You are leading individuals who are in the work. They get it. They're professional. Many times they've studied this. I know that I'm working with youth development practitioners and experts like yourselves who get it. And yet we still need a little bit of help when it comes to getting it right and execution, right? And also getting people to have their own growth mindset and be open to things. How do you do that with a group of individuals you're entrusted with? Because change is hard. Change is really hard, especially in adulting.
Yeah, that's great. When you have the solution to that, Brenda, let me know, and I will send it out. Well, a couple of things come to mind. One is my unit, the school mental health unit, works with lots of providers. So we're working with over 70 mental health agencies, hospitals, and social service agencies. And they all, their missions are very strong, their purposes are very strong, and their intention. But I think this year, we were all in the same boat. This was new to all of us. So one of the things that we did was we got, instead of every other month checking in, having meetings, it was in some cases some on a weekly basis, and then every 2 or 3 weeks. And it was really trying to create an open system for them to understand what we were doing in terms of the DOE in this system and how we could support them. And then we got the State Office of Mental Health involved, and so we were able to do Telemental Health. And this was new for them as well. How do you, just like we're doing now, right? How to have a virtual session, how to create a virtual classroom. So we tapped into a number of national networks that were able to help us to do that. So we offered webinars, we offered trainings, the ability then to get feedback. So students, some of our students, as you know, they live in apartments where there may be 5 or 6 people, 1 or 2 bedrooms. How do you have a private session? Do you go into a closet? Do you go into a bathroom? Can you text? Is texting allowed? Is that HIPAA compliant? So as a part of the, as our partners, our unit did a lot of working with the regulators, working with, what DOE would allow and not, see where we could get waivers to help folks. And I think, to your point, we all learned together. So we, in a sense, we created these learning communities. So we did that more. Internally, and I'm sure all your organizations dealt with this, we're also in the midst of the pandemic. We have families who are ill, families lost, food shortages, poverty for the first time, living with folks who have compromised immune systems. again, living in communities where there's a lot of health disparities. So that was the first thing, and I have to say, for transparency, as a leader, I hadn't dealt with before. So my learning curve was like this, and helping, being transparent, giving as much information as we could when we knew it, how to decrease the anxiety, what kind of self-care we could offer. And this is something I always talk with folks. A lot of agencies are offering self-care, but they're not giving their staff enough time to do the self-care. So we have to like really know.
Yeah.
So we created mindful moments, sort of half hour once a week, decompression, stress related, stress reduction. All my staff is trained in stress reduction. So they went into the schools, they went with the teachers, they offered stress reduction training for parents, for teachers, because they're the primary caretakers, they're the teachers. So, you have to take care of your staff, you have to take care of the teachers, because from a system perspective, the school is our client. So we have to help the school internalize some of the things and listen to them. We work with UFT. The UFT, for those who don't know, that's the teachers union, and their phones were ringing off the hook. So we got to help each other. We created a learning community with the UFT to help what we could do on the ground, what they could do after hours. So it was an all hands on deck. I think it is listening. I think it was a kind of mind, I'm going to use your term, I love that, the growth mindset in systems that are often fixed mindsets. So how do you take those fixed mindsets and start to open them up? And I think with a lot of persistence, a lot of hours, we were able to do that. And there's going to be some lessons learned from all of this that we can bring into the next year.
Yeah, and I think that's a natural place for us to go next. And I'm going to open it up to the three of you to think about this a little bit. And I know this is beyond the questions, but it's a natural place to be right now. The lessons learned. Sometimes I'm sitting here thinking, we've done this virtual space. It's had some pains, but there's been some really wonderful things that have happened around increased engagement, understanding, being able to have a wider reach, greater impact. To Larry's point, the virtual piece, creating those informal settings that we take for granted so many times in person. So my question to all of you is, we've learned some things, we've done some things, and the switch is going to go on any day now across the state, where it's like, it's all open, no mask, everybody has a vaccine, yay, school's back. And we're all eager to do that. Look, no one more than I who has had children in virtual learning since last March, right? I'm ready. I'm ready for them to have a social life again, even if I become the taxi driver. I'm all about it. But my question becomes, how do we preserve some of this? Because going back completely to in person, I don't know. I have my moments where I don't know. So talk to me a little bit about where you are. What are you thinking? What are some of the salient things you'd like to keep as we go into September of, free-for-all openings? Any one of you think go ahead.
Go ahead, Noreen.
I was just going to say, I think one thing that really sticks out for me is the fact that so many mentors and educators have lost that self-care component someone mentioned earlier, in the sense that we just rose to the occasion and it was just full throttle for 18 months and we're still just kind of reeling from it. But what I've realized, and I did a discussion with this group of an empowerment circle for women, educators, teachers, and we were talking about disorganization. What are the mental health impacts of being cluttered? What is the byproduct of feeling that forever kind of disorganization? And because it's not just the physical, it's also the intangible things, feeling like you don't know what's going on. There's just so many things happening. You're trying to push yourself so hard. But what I think we really need to remember to take with us into the next phase is that an empty cup can't pour out to others. So when our own internal stores are depleted, we can't give what we don't have. So I think people need to be comfortable with kind of reeling it back a little bit, because if we're being real, a lot of people are exhausted, way past the physical level. It's this deep, like the sustained hypervigilance is resulting in this chronic and inescapable pervasive fatigue that is just kind of going and going and going. So taking the onus and saying, you know what, I need to kind of build back up some of those boundaries as a mentor, in the sense of, you know, full access to time all the time isn't healthy in that same way. So I don't think it's sustainable. So I feel that people need to feel comfortable and feel okay with saying, I did what I needed to do in the moment, and I'll still be there for my students in every single way possible. But I also have to start thinking about how I take care of myself and how my colleagues are taking care of themselves, because we won't be able to sustain this much longer.
So for me, it's, you know, a variety of things that if I had that magical power, I would like to see continue. You know, one of the big things that sticks out for me, I look at suspension data very frequently, and I analyze it. And I looked at it recently for our middle school and our high school, and we had 90% fewer suspensions this year compared to last year in the same time period. Specifically in the high school, 17 total students served a suspension this year compared to 162 last year. In the middle school, 10 total students. This year, 72 last year from September to March 13. And for both schools, no disproportionality across race for those suspensions, which we had in both schools last year. So many people would probably respond to that, well, of course, you know, there was a lot of full remote instruction, it was hybrid, but I think we need to, as educators, reflect on that as decision makers and realize that this is an outcome that was different from last year for many students and many students of color. And I think about it, you know, other than being more culturally responsive, more responsive to social emotional wellness, just the structure of our buildings, having during that hybrid instruction, we've had students in the building, and we didn't see this uptick, a real big uptick in suspensions when students return for hybrid. So having fewer students in the building, maybe having more opportunity for some intimate conversations, connecting interpersonally. But the big one that really is likely going to change for our district next year, in my new role, I chair the annual review of our code of conduct. And since I've been in that position, we've really included restorative practices, trauma-informed care language in our code of conduct. And I've always had an issue with the policing of hats and hoods. I've witnessed so many power struggles, so many discipline referrals with students wearing hats and hoods in the school setting. And often it's students of color. And this year, because we decided as a district to be flexible with keeping windows open, and you know Buffalo gets cold, we had flexibility to allow students and staff to wear hats, to put their hoods up, to wear coats, to wear gloves. And there were zero problems with it. I know of no complaints about how them interfering with learning and interfering with instruction or behavior in any way. So as a part of the Code of Conduct review this year, we had the courageous conversation, and we really had the conversation about how this is impacting students of color. And the committee has come to a consensus for next year to eliminate the prohibition of hats, hoods, headgear for next school year. It's gone before our Board of Education and for a first read, and hopefully will be approved in the next meeting. So I am very inspired by that process. And when I talk about the pandemic compelling us to change, that is one example where it has compelled us to embrace real change. That's going to have a positive impact on many students for next school year and beyond.
That's great, Larry. Thank you for that. That's a wonderful example. Maybe we can see that across the state at some point. I was going to say take some pictures. a couple of things, again, going back from a systemic point of view, one of the things I mentioned earlier was telemental health. So one of the things we've learned is that providers, mental health providers, have a little more flexibility. So when they would have a session with a parent, say 9 in the morning, they say, you know, I got to get the laundry in. Is okay? Is somebody around at 3 or 4? Yeah, I can make 3 or 4. So that flexibility. Yeah, we have somebody who can talk to you at 7. What's the best time for you? Where parents, when they go to schools to these on-site services, it's got to be when the school is open. It's got to be at a certain time. You got to leave your job, or find a babysitter, or take all the kids to talk about one. So that flexibility was something we were able to add in and use. To do some more telepsychiatry was also something that we found. So the lessons learned through the Telemental Health has been advocated to the State Office of Mental Health. They're really looking into it. We're hoping that the governor will sign something so that it continues. Some of the consent forms were more verbal. Some of the things that we have to go through, that the bureaucratic, hoops, so to speak, the silos were cut, and nothing happened. Nobody got hurt. It's like, oh, okay, this is good. So we're hoping to see that. I think one of the advocacy aspects is, I was talking before about that fixed mind system, and units and other agencies that really were tough to kind of break into, or the partnerships weren't as strong. They started to come to the mental health unit and help us. We need your help. What can you do? And so those relationships that might have been more like a dotted line, if you think about it, are now strong, solid lines, working with superintendents that we weren't able to do as much before, who didn't know what they had in their districts. It was like, oh, this is great. What do you need? How can we help you now? So now we're leveraging those relationships, again, to cut across systems, to make sure all programs are the same. And one of the ways we did it was really curating resources for parents, for students, for teachers, again, everything from stress reduction to how do you talk to a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old about the pandemic, and about various issues that the families and the students were concerned about. So I think that idea of showing up, saying yes, doing your best to get it, is a way to forge stronger relationships that now we will continue. And I think for many folks saying, oh, now we know what you do. Now we know how you can help us. They'll have us on speed dial.
And I love that, because I think that you all captured 3 things that any program, regardless of what system they are in, really needs to pay attention to. 1, their people. Are they healthy enough to be in front of young people to do this work? And to be okay with saying, I'm not okay. I think, to your point, Noreen, I had this lingering burnout that I know it's like the candle's almost gone, but it won't go. And I keep coming back, but I know what it is. It's the haze of the 18 months. And sometimes you have to embrace it and say it out loud so that people can acknowledge it, see it, and say, okay, you're okay. Don't worry. Take a time out. So I think that's really important. I think, to your point, Larry, taking the time to look at the data and let it inform you. I mean, we let it inform us when it's horrible news. But then when it's good news, we become skeptics of, well, that's because it was the pandemic, and it's like, no, there was a change in behavior by all of us that lead us down this path. Let's take a look at it. And so programs really have to start to evaluate what was really working with young people in this virtual reality, as painful as it was, and what needs to be preserved and maybe changed as they come back to this in-person reality that we have. And then, Scott, I think you can say it, better than anyone in saying, look, we create bureaucracies wherever we want to sometimes, trying to preserve the innocent when really it's to preserve a system that's, never been evaluated or looked at, or it's comfortable. That's how we always do it, right? And so I think program leaders and nonprofit CEOs in schools really have to look at how much of this is that's the way we've always done it, and how much of it is that it's actually a practical way of having to do something. But I think within that, your point about parent engagement is so important. I often hear program practitioners, leaders, schools tell us how disengaged parents are, that they really don't care about their kids. And God forbid it's because at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I can't meet with you, right? I often say, my kids go to a private school, they have a lot of blessings. I'm a working mom. But if you make the meeting at 5:30, I'm the sweaty mom who ran to the meeting and is there 30 minutes late every time. Watch my kids' eyes roll through the back of their head while they're embarrassed, right? I can't make it work. My schedule won't allow it, And so that parent engagement, this thing opens a whole new world for parent engagement. So I think those really 3 key things that you all just spoke about are so key for program leaders to look at as just simple things that they can do as we reopen and not get lost, in the shuffle. So I wanted to ask, one last question. I'll open it up to the 3 of you. You can look at it in different perspectives from your work. Um, and so we'll look at it from this perspective. You know, um, we're going to go back. People have lost people. There's been trauma. It's been clear. We're exhausted. We're hoping that the summer gives us a respite. People are getting vaccinated, not getting vaccinated. It's a whole spectrum of things. And the challenges that await us are still very much the unknown. How do we show up and not be performative in nature and go through the mechanics again of being in school and being in our programs and just checking off boxes and being more mindful about how we do our work with young people? How are you going to sort of double down on some of the things that you think are really important to get done?
Well, I'll speak quickly. Yeah. Again, I think as I mentioned a little earlier, we have to acknowledge we can't be in denial. Trust will go out the window. And as students have told us that I need to have a trusted adult in that school. And we've all probably could say, who was that person when we were in high school or middle school, that one teacher? And sometimes it was the lunchroom lady, or for me, it was the librarians, because they could tolerate my energy. And so it was, God bless them, they were great. And they helped me a lot, and I trusted them. So I think we have to come in, all of us, as authentic as possible. To your point, Brenda, I think, that's an interesting another conversation about how do teachers and the adults bring their authenticity to the work and not deny what they've gone through, but also know where those rails, so to speak, guardrails are about sharing or not sharing. That's for each person to get to. But kids will see right through you if you don't. They won't do that. I think another thing is we're looking, just as we did parent chats, we want to have student chats. Again, non-directive places where they can come and just talk about. I think as Larry was saying earlier, it's therapeutic, but it's not therapy. So they don't think you're psychoanalyzing me or you're a shrink or something. One of the things we're going to start to do this summer, New York City schools are going to be open. There'll be 700 schools. CBOs are going to be working with the schools. So the whole afternoon will be activities, arts and craft, things of that nature. Open 8 to 6 for parents to know that the kids are being taken care of. We're going to have drop-in groups. And those drop-in groups are going to, with different themes about racial equity and issues, gratitude, stress, signs and symptoms. How do you know you're having, issues, and how to help? and do it in a way that's kind of like a safety net. In other words, we're not going to go lean in so much, and we're not going to lean that far back, but how do we meet them where they are? I always think of working with students as the proximity. How far do we move in? How far do we move back? And allow them, I think, as folks are using this growth and allowing them to unfold and identify with other students what they went through.
I would say, I think I definitely agree with a lot of that. And I think that in order to leave that performative aspect behind, we have to be ready, as we've been discussing today, to really engage in the dialogue and have those politically charged conversations, those triggering topics. I like to think of it kind of as like a racial systemic homeostasis, where there's a lot of factors that are just cogs that are interconnected in our society, and they're just perpetuating and feeding the system, and it keeps going. So those hard conversations around race, racism, what does that actually look like, even when it's unintentional? Minority, what does being a minority look like? Socialization, mobility, discrimination, our de facto segregation here in the city. And just there's so many factors that I think we have to be willing to be brave, because it's tough, it's not easy to engage in these conversations, and being okay with knowing that you might not know everything, and you might have to look things up, and you might need to figure out, how do I come and be ready for these students? And I think the other thing I would say is that we have to stop shoulding on ourselves. So that whole, like, I should have done this, I should have known better, I should have accomplished this already. There's so many ways we can look at it that are just not going to be helpful. Those self-imposed value judgments are not going to move us forward. So as mentors and educators, if we can kind of try to mute that inner critic and really focus on being mindful and committing to being in the present, I think that as long as we're looking at it as a journey that we're engaging in, it comes back to that growth mindset. Like, we know we can grow, we know we can improve. There's going to be bumps, it's going to be tough, but going into this next season, willing to do the work.
So at first, I apologize if you hear announcements or dismissing buses. So hopefully that won't overpower my voice. But I think I'll just reiterate that providing that time in our school day for staff to feel okay about chatting with students, checking in with them, having those informal interactions and opportunities and experiences. But I'll share two specific examples, both in Kenton and Buffalo, that we're preparing for as we enter the summer and going into next year. So in Kenton, our staff development center is making social emotional wellness a priority, with the theme is Be Well. And we're starting this summer focusing on courses that are in that social emotional wellness area. I'm teaching two courses actually, one on circle keeping, and then one on mindfulness, social emotional learning, and cultural competence. So I'm proud that our district is recognizing that this is important and that we need to prepare our staff for when September comes. In Buffalo, similar to what Scott mentioned, we are planning some very robust programming for the summer, and not just academic programming, but arts, music, sports. We know our kids not only need social emotional wellness interaction, but also some good physical activity. And we have several strong community schools that provide multifaceted supports and interventions that really, because of the pandemic, haven't been able to operate the way they usually do. So we will have those up and running again. We have Saturday academies where the schools are open for students to access, families to access, for enrichment, academic support, social emotional support. And we have a nonprofit organization, Say Yes Buffalo, that provides a range of services, including family support specialists in our schools, as well as mental health clinics. So those will be up and running again, to be ready to meet those needs that we know are going to be a concern when we return in September. Oh, and lastly, I want to mention too, that along with the disparities, racial disparities in the pandemic, we all know that with the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement that really elevated last year, our Office of Culturally and Linguistically Responsive Initiatives in Buffalo really elevated this work in a remote model. And so we infused the 1619 project. We infused we call now our emancipation curriculum. And it really has been a priority in the remote instruction and throughout this entire year. I've seen it with both of my boys, and the things that they're sharing that are historically accurate, that are elevating Black and brown voices throughout American history. So I'm hopeful that will continue as we enter next year, because I think that alone, you have a curriculum like that can empower so many of our youth, and then as they move through their career and become adults.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. I think that when we look at everything you all have suggested, I think program leaders have to understand that there are a lot of networks and partners that they should be engaging with to find out what resources are available for the young people that they're serving, to support their work a little further, and to be able to continue to uplift their staff and their work. And more importantly, I think, to your point, Larry, infusing the learning of identity for young people, especially when you're working with brown and Black youth at this time, is really, really important. It's something we have to embrace for our young people, and by no means do we leave our white students, our Asian students out, our Latino students. Everybody our Native students have to be in the table and understand history in its accuracy and navigate its pain, its joy, and its significance in order to be, at a place where you become healthy and start to navigate solutions that actually are, forward thinking with some foresight rather than repetitive in history, right? I want to thank you all for taking the time to have this conversation with me today. You've been exceptional. And I think it's been really helpful for program providers to understand what's happening in different school systems across the state. Sometimes we'd like to believe that the school building is always broken. We learned very quickly during this pandemic that when the school building is shut, we have an issue. A lot of things permeate and move around that building. And I think that trying to create a construct where school becomes a thriving, healthy environment, so all these programs supporting young people can also thrive, is really, really important. So I want to thank you again for all your work, and thank our attendees for attending. We'll be doing Mentoring Take 2 momentarily and sending out some of the recordings to you so you can watch it. There'll also be some resources and tips available to you that Larry, Scott, and Noreen have mentioned throughout our panel discussion today, so that you have it. And I think if my team is on, they're going to put a barcode with a survey to see how we were doing and whether or not you enjoyed the conversation or have any feedback on future wellness webinars that you'd like to see. So that should be popping up shortly. And there you go. And if you see there's a Q barcode, Q code, whatever it is that they call it, you put your phone up when you open the camera and it pops up and the survey appears. There's also a link to the survey in the chat that you could take the time to click on so that you can complete the survey. And again, thank you so much to Scott, Larry, Noreen, for all your expertise and your amazing work in the community. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.
my pleasure.